What if the cross that promised salvation came accompanied by blood-stained swords? What if baptism was not a choice, but a sentence? This is the story where faith and iron collide, and conversion becomes war. At the heart of Europe, 12 centuries ago, a proud people stood against the most powerful empire of the West. The Saxons, warriors of the forests, raised their spears against Charlemagne and his faith. But their struggle was not merely political, it was spiritual. The clash between Germanic paganism and Imperial Christianity turned villages into battlefields, rivers into cemeteries, and baptisms into public executions. This is not just a forgotten story. It is a wound that forever scarred the faith of the West. Today, here on the channel Faith and Power, we will unearth this bloody conversion. If you seek to understand where faith and power intertwine, subscribe now. The truth is about to be revealed. Amid the dense forests of Germania, where the treetops filtered light like wild stained glass, lived a people who carried in their soul the hardness of iron and the reverence for ancient gods. The Saxons, frontier warriors, children of the forest and of blood, raised their shields not only against invaders, but against destiny itself. To them, every stone, every spring, every sacred tree pulsed with the presence of the gods. The world was not empty. It was inhabited by spirits, invisible forces that demanded respect and sacrifice. At the center of their faith stood the Irminsul, the great sacred pillar, described by Frankish chroniclers as a gigantic column raised toward the heavens, symbolizing the link between the world of men and the world of the gods. Before it, the Saxons made offerings of animals, weapons, and even war prisoners. The Irminsul was not mere carved wood. It was the spiritual heart of a nation. These were times of unstable frontiers. Germania, still untamed, bordered an empire on the rise, the Franks. With Charlemagne at its head, the Christian armies sought not only territory but souls. Imperial Christianity, which had already transformed Rome, now extended its iron hand toward the Germanic peoples. And for the Saxons, this advance was not evangelization. It was invasion. The Franks arrived with bishops beside generals, crosses beside spears. Where they built churches, they felled sacred trees. Where they preached Christ, they scorned Woden and Donar. For the Saxons, to accept baptism was to betray the gods, abandon the ancestors, and deny their very identity. Thus, when Charlemagne demanded submission, they answered with the sword. The first campaigns were brutal. Saxon villages were burned, and in response, the warriors ambushed Frankish detachments in the forests. The war was not waged in open fields, but through swift strikes, like wolves emerging from the darkness. Each battle was not merely political, it was religious, a clash between two universes. Christian chroniclers recorded the destruction of the Irminsul as a triumph. They say that in 772, Charlemagne personally ordered the sacred column to be torn down. When the axe struck the wood, it was not only a symbol that fell, it was the spiritual heart of a people being shattered. For the Saxons, that act was a declaration of war against the gods themselves. Imagine the scene. Saxon warriors hidden among the trees, watching helplessly as their sacred world was desecrated. The dust of the Irminsul rose into the air like collective mourning. Many believed the gods had allowed its fall only to test their courage. Others, seized with fury, swore eternal vengeance against the Christians. But the struggle was not only physical, it was psychological. The Franks promised eternal salvation to those who embraced the faith of Christ, but delivered the immediate condemnation of the sword to those who refused. The Saxons, in turn, believed that the honor of dying in battle was the greatest tribute. They could offer the gods. Thus, every clash became a confrontation of opposing visions of life and death itself. Within Saxon villages, the elders gathered in councils. Some defended total war. Better to die with an axe in hand than live on our knees before a foreign god. Others, more cautious, feared that resistance would bring total destruction. It was a moral and spiritual dilemma: to fight for the ancestral faith or survive by submitting to a baptism imposed by force. Women also played an essential role. While the men fought, they kept tradition alive, teaching their children the hymns of the gods and preparing secret rituals so that the faith would not be erased. Often they were the guardians of memory, ensuring that even amid forced Christianization, the names of Woden and Donar echoed through future generations. And there were prophets, shamans, and priests who claimed to receive visions from the ancient gods, promising victory if the people did not abandon their loyalty. Some proclaimed that Saxon blood spilled in battle would be like seeds, germinating into future triumphs. Others warned that the wrath of the gods would fall upon those who allowed themselves to be baptized. These voices fueled the resistance. 2. The Franks, the Saxons, were barbarians who needed to be purified by faith. To the Saxons, the Franks were oppressors trying to erase their soul. With each battle, entire villages were destroyed. With each forced baptism, families were divided. It was a slow erosion, where the cross advanced at the cost of blood. The Saxon fields, once filled with pagan songs, began to echo with laments. But the war was only beginning. Charlemagne would accept no resistance, and the Saxons would accept no submission. With every Frankish victory, a Saxon rebellion rose. It was an endless cycle of destruction and vengeance. Frankish chroniclers would later write that the fall of the Irminsul marked the beginning of the conversion of the Saxons. But in truth, it was the beginning of a bloody conflict that would last for decades. For when a people are forced to choose between their ancestral faith and survival, the struggle becomes inevitable. The Saxon warriors, with painted shields and iron swords, knew they were facing not just an army but an empire. And still, they stood as human walls before the storm. For them, to live without faith was worse than to die. Thus, the stage was set for the bloodiest war of conversion in history. The Irminsul had fallen, but the hearts of the Saxons still burned like embers, and Charlemagne had not yet seen the worst. Charles. That name, spoken by the chroniclers, echoed like the thunder of a rising empire. To the Germanic peoples, he was not merely a king, he was the very embodiment of Rome reborn. Charlemagne, son of the Franks, grandson of the Merovingians, ruled not as a tribal lord, but as a Christian Caesar. He believed his mission came not only from blood or sword, but from God, and his vision was clear: to unite Europe under the cross. For him, the Saxons were more than rebels. They were a stain of paganism in the heart of Christendom. As long as there were forests where Woden was worshipped, as long as there were warriors who refused baptism, his work remained incomplete. Thus, when he looked north toward Saxon lands, he did not see mere territories, but souls in rebellion against Christ. The Carolingian court was not only military but religious. Bishops advised on strategies both spiritual and martial. Preachers accompanied armies. Priests turned campaign tents into makeshift chapels. The war against the Saxons was described as a crusade before the word even existed. It was not only conquest, it was salvation by force. The Frankish army differed from Saxon warbands. Organized, heavy, disciplined. Knights armed with lance and shield advanced in tight formation, a true wall of iron. Behind them, banners bore the Golden Cross, a sign that combat itself was a liturgy of war. For the Saxons, the sight of these armies was like facing a storm of steel. And Charles did not limit himself to winning battles. He built castles, churches, and fortresses immediately after each victory. Where sacred groves once stood, a stone church now rose. Where pagan rituals had been held, the Christian. Bell now marked the hours. His strategy was clear: to transform the enemy's physical and spiritual landscape. The chronicler's narratives always ennoble him. Charles the Just, the defender of the faith. But behind the glory lay brutal pragmatism. He knew that conquering Saxons did not simply mean defeating warriors, it meant breaking traditions. For this reason, every military victory was followed by mass baptisms. Men, women, and children were led to the riverside not to celebrate, but to submit. Many were forced to swear loyalty not only to Christ, but to Charles himself. For the Saxons, this baptism was humiliation. How could they accept a ritual that denied their gods? Many entered the water only to save their lives, secretly vowing to return to the old rites when possible. Forced conversion created Christians in appearance only, and each baptism lit a new flame of hatred against the Franks. Charles, however, believed he was fulfilling destiny. His vision went far beyond Germania. He dreamed of a Christian empire to rival ancient Rome, an empire where the Pope in Rome would be his ally and legitimizer, and where every Germanic people would bow before the cross. The Saxons in this grand design were but a piece to be shaped by force. The campaigns were relentless. Charles led yearly expeditions, marching with thousands of soldiers, burning villages, destroying crops, taking hostages. Chroniclers note that he never accepted lasting truces. Each Saxon rebellion was met with harsher punishment. It was an endless cycle of blood, and there was more. Charles was not only a warrior king, he was a political strategist. He knew that the Saxon War unified his own people. Nothing binds a nation like a common enemy. As the Franks saw Charles as Christ's champion, his authority grew stronger. The war was not only against the Saxons, but for the very cohesion of the empire. In popular imagination, Charles became almost mythical. Songs hailed him as the new Constantine, bringing light where there was darkness. But to the Saxons, he was the iron hammer, the destroyer of forests, the defiler of gods. This duality shows how history is never singular. It always depends on who holds the pen. The battles against the Saxons were not mere open-field clashes. Many times they were prolonged sieges. Wooden fortresses were burned. Captured warriors were executed as warnings. At other times, Charles took noble Saxon hostages, forcing families to remain loyal under the threat of their children's deaths. It was psychological warfare, where fear was as vital as the sword. Even so, Saxon resistance did not cease. Whenever Charles believed he had pacified the region, a new revolt arose. The forests were vast, the villages hidden, and the warriors knew every river, every secret path. It was like trying to hold water in one's hands. The tighter Charles gripped, the more resistance slipped through his fingers. What drove Charles to persevere? Was it ambition? Was it sincere faith? Perhaps both. For he believed that without religious unity there could be no peace. To him, permitting paganism was to invite rebellion. Thus, baptism was as much an act of faith as it was a measure of political security. And so, year after year, the cross marched with the army. Latin chants mingled with war cries. Banners bearing the cross advanced like spiritual swords, and each victory was celebrated as a sacred rite. It was holy war before holy war. The Saxons, however, did not see Charles as a savior, but as a tyrant. Their forests were being burned, their traditions crushed, their gods mocked. For them, resistance was not mere politics. It was survival with honor. And so, the stage was set for one of the most brutal episodes of the medieval world. The moment when Charlemagne would turn his fury into massacre. For faith, when it becomes a sword, knows no mercy. The year was 782. The waters of the Aller River flowed quietly, but on its banks that silence would be shattered by the sound of death. The place would forever be marked as Verden, symbol of Charlemagne's fury and of Saxon suffering. The Saxons, after years of resistance, had rebelled once again. This was nothing new. Every time Charles believed he had imposed peace, the forest warriors rose up. But this particular revolt cut deeply into imperial pride. The Saxons had not merely disobeyed, they had attacked Frankish detachments, destroyed fortresses, and openly defied Charles's authority. It was a direct affront, and for the emperor, such insolence demanded an exemplary response. Chroniclers record that Charles gathered a formidable army and marched to Verden to crush the rebellion. The Saxons, outnumbered and outorganized, could not hold out for long. Many surrendered, believing that surrender would bring mercy. But mercy was not in the king's vocabulary that day. There, by the river, history would record one of the darkest massacres of Christendom. According to Frankish chronicles, about 4,500 Saxons were executed. Not in battle, but in a deliberate act, a collective punishment. The emperor made no distinction between leaders and peasants, warriors and farmers. The order was to kill. Picture the scene. Thousands of men bound, kneeling before Frankish troops. The banner of the cross fluttered, not as a sign of mercy, but as a witness of blood. Blades rose, and the soil of Verden was drenched with lives torn away in the name of faith and imperial order. The slaughter was so vast that later chroniclers recounted it with statistical coldness, as if noting the tally of cattle slaughtered. Yet what was even more disturbing was this. Charlemagne, celebrated by the church as the defender of the faith, stood behind the order. The emperor, whom Christendom would call the Great, became, for the Saxons, the Butcher of Verden. The official records describe the act as necessary for pacification, but even among Christian chroniclers, unease lingered. Some tried to justify it by saying the Saxons had broken their oaths time and again, and that execution was rightful punishment. Others, in their silence, revealed that this was not divine justice. It was brutal vengeance. Over the centuries, the Massacre of Verden became a battleground of memory. Some tried to soften the numbers. A few modern scholars suggested the figure of 4,500 might be an exaggeration or a scribal error. Others argue it was real, that Charles truly ordered mass slaughter. The absolute truth may never be known, but the symbolic impact is undeniable. Verden became a scar engraved into the memory of Germania. For the surviving Saxons, Verden did not mean submission, but rage. If Charles had hoped to break their spirit, he achieved the opposite. The blood spilled fueled hatred, and new revolts erupted in the years to come. Every family that lost a father, a brother, a son, now carried within them the fire of vengeance. And here lies the moral dilemma. How far can faith go in justifying such violence? Charles believed he was defending Christian order, but at Verden, the cross was stained. Was it still the symbol of salvation, or had it become the banner of oppression? The theology of the time hardly questioned it. The prevailing idea was that the unity of faith justified any sacrifice. Better that thousands perish than to allow religious division. But would Christ, who preached love and mercy, recognize his message in that scene of slaughter? That question has echoed through the centuries, unsettling hearts to this day. The political impact was immediate. The massacre spread fear. Many Saxon clans, faced with such brutality, chose to bow the knee. Yet paradoxically, resistance was not erased. Leaders like Widukind, the Saxon hero, continued to rally warriors, becoming symbols of defiance against the empire. Widukind had not been present at Verden, but his absence only strengthened the myth. He was the indomitable warrior who escaped the grasp of the Frankish giant. The Saxon forests became havens of conspiracy. Secret hymns were sung to the old gods. Children grew up hearing tales not of defeat, but of sacrifice. To them, the dead of Verden were martyrs of the ancestral faith. Just as Christians exalted their martyrs in Roman arenas, the Saxons now had theirs, slain under the sword of Charles. Curiously, the church itself wavered in how it remembered Verden. For centuries it chose silence, exalting Charles as Rex Christianissimus, the most Christian king. In the year 800, only 18 years after the massacre, the Pope crowned Charles emperor in Rome. The blood of Verden was still fresh, yet in papal logic, political greatness outweighed any stain. Christendom needed a Caesar, no matter how many corpses paved the way. Centuries later, Enlightenment critics would point to Verden as proof of how religion and power conspire to justify atrocities. To them, Charles was no saint or hero, but a tyrant disguised as a missionary. By the 19th century, German nationalists reinterpreted Verden as a symbol of native resistance against foreign domination. The massacre became a malleable memory, molded to serve different agendas. But for the Saxons of the 8th century, there was no rhetoric, only grief. Widows, orphans, empty villages. The void left by the dead was filled with a bitter certainty. The cross that promised eternal life had come to them as a sentence of death. Thus, Verden remains one of the darkest episodes of medieval Christendom. For there, beneath the shadow of the cross, power revealed its most ruthless face. It was not conversion. It was not evangelization. It was extermination in the name of God. After the massacre of Verden, many believed the worst had already passed. But Charlemagne had not yet revealed the full extent of his strategy. If bloodshed alone could not bend the Saxons, then law would become an invisible sword, written on parchment, yet sharp as any blade. Thus was born the most feared document of forced Christianization, the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae. This set of decrees, issued between 782 and 785, was not merely a legal code. It was a political, theological, and military weapon. Here was laid out the ruthless rule: either the Saxon people submitted to baptism and the Christian faith, or they faced death. There was no room for neutrality. Religion, once a matter of conscience, had become a matter of survival. Each article of the Capitulatio fell like a hammer upon the anvil of empire. If anyone refuses baptism, let him die. If anyone sacrifices to the old gods, let him die. If anyone eats meat during Lent, let him die. The list went on relentlessly, criminalizing not only ancestral faith, but also daily customs, cultural gestures, even dietary habits. The message was clear. This was not about voluntary conversion, but the total destruction of a way of life. For the Saxons, this was more than humiliation. It was an attempt to erase their very identity. Every home, every family, every ritual stood under threat. The fire of their sacred bonfires would be silenced by the ringing of Christian bells. Children would be taught not to pray to Woden, but to Christ. And if any father dared to pass on the old traditions in secret, he risked the lives of his entire family. The Capitulatio was not only repression, it was cultural engineering. While it punished, it also reorganized. It established churches in conquered lands, imposed the payment of tithes, instituted Christian festivals as the official calendar. Christianity was not offered as an alternative, but imposed as the only possible reality. The law left no choice. Picture the Saxon elders, once gathered under trees for rituals, now dragged before Frankish priests to swear loyalty to a foreign god. Picture mothers forbidden to sing ancestral songs to their children under penalty of death. Religion was not just a spiritual matter. It was the fabric of culture, and that fabric was being torn before their eyes. Charlemagne believed he was carrying out divine will. In his vision, the unity of the empire depended on the unity of faith. Religious diversity was not tolerated. It was seen as a threat. And so the emperor did not hesitate to turn the cross into an instrument of legal coercion. Baptism ceased to be a sacrament of love and became a symbol of submission. Many Saxons yielded, accepting baptism only to survive. But others rebelled even more fiercely. Revolts continued to erupt, led by figures such as Widukind, who became a legend of resistance. For these warriors, the Capitulatio was not law. It was outrage. And each attempt to impose Christianity by force only fueled their fury. The Frankish chroniclers, however, celebrated the document as the triumph of civilization over barbarism. To them, the Saxons were not merely pagans, but savages who needed to be tamed. The Capitulatio was hailed as light dispelling darkness. But what kind of light was it? When it illuminated the path to the gallows. Even within the empire, not all accepted the brutality of the law so easily. Records speak of voices calling for moderation, reminding that faith should be born from the heart, not from fear. Still, Charles's logic prevailed. Without discipline, there could be no order. Without order, no empire. The immediate result was a climate of terror. Entire villages lived under constant threat of punishment. Priests roamed the settlements, supervising rituals, denouncing suspects of pagan practice. Faith, which should have been refuge, became an instrument of surveillance. And each baptism celebrated was, for many, a silent funeral of Saxon identity. Yet the Capitulatio failed to achieve its promise. Instead of sincere conversion, it bred widespread hypocrisy. Many Saxons publicly accepted the cross, but in secret continued to invoke their gods. Christianity grew in numbers, but not in hearts. It was a religion imposed, not chosen, and here lies the tragedy. Christianity, once persecuted and sustained by the blood of its martyrs, had now become the persecutor. The gospel of mercy was transformed into a code of death. Christ's words, "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved," were reinterpreted as, "Whoever does not believe shall be executed." This profound inversion left wounds that would echo for centuries. For Saxon memory carried forever the imprint of a Christianity imposed with iron and fire. And even among the faithful remained the uneasy question, what value does a faith won by the sword truly hold? Charlemagne, however, did not hesitate. In his mind, every execution was a spiritual victory, every forced baptism a soul snatched from the devil's grip. The Capitulatio was not cruelty without purpose, but sacred strategy. So he believed. But for the Saxons, it was tyranny disguised as salvation. The document would stand as the ultimate example of how political power and faith can fuse until they become indistinguishable. And Verden, which had shown the fury of the sword, now found its continuation in the coldness of the pen. Conversion ceased to be a choice and became a sentence. Thus, the Capitulatio became the true face of Saxon Christianization, not dialogue, but imposition, not gospel, but law, not faith, but fear. And the price would be paid in blood, in tears, and in generations scarred forever. When the flames of Saxon revolts began to fade, it was not because the spirit of the people had surrendered, but because the crushing weight of empire had become unbearable. Decades of campaigns, executions, and forced baptisms had turned Saxon lands into a landscape marked by blood and ashes. And yet, out of that destruction, something new emerged. A Christianized land, but one full of scars. Monasteries were the visible face of this transformation. Where groves had once been dedicated to the gods, abbeys now rose. The monks did not come with swords, but with books. They brought Latin, writing, canon law. What weapons could not destroy, the daily rhythm of monastic life slowly eroded. It was a second invasion, silent, patient, but just as powerful. Monastic schools trained the future Saxon elites. Sons of nobles who had once led rebellions now learned to copy gospels and sing psalms. What their fathers had sought to destroy in battle, they reproduced in stone classrooms. It was the cultural victory of the empire. Yet it was not full acceptance. It was adaptation, survival. Many of these youths carried within them the conflict between the traditions taught at home and the doctrine imposed by the monks. The very geography of Saxony was reshaped. the land was reorganized into dioceses, tying it directly to the ecclesiastical structure of the empire. Villages that had once lived by the rhythm of crops and pagan rites now followed the Christian liturgical calendar. Christmas replaced solstice festivals. Easter overshadowed old spring rites. But behind the Christian feasts, many ancient practices survived in disguise, hidden beneath new forms. It was common to see peasants who, after attending Mass, would secretly leave offerings at springs or sacred trees, as their ancestors had always done. Fusion was inevitable. The faith imposed by the empire blended with local belief, creating a hybrid Christianity shaped by cultural resistance. Charlemagne, however, did not tolerate half-conversions. To him, every monastery built was a spiritual fortress. Every bishop sent was a general of the faith. The empire consolidated itself not only with stone walls, but with walls of prayer. Baptism, once imposed through fear, became institutional routine. Slowly, the faith that had begun with the sword began to take root through repetition. But the scars remained. Widows remembered husbands slain at Verden. Grandparents whispered the names of the old gods, preserving memory like embers hidden under ashes. There was silence, but no forgetting. Pain passed from generation to generation, shaping how the Saxons related to their new faith. Here lies the paradox. Many Saxons eventually became sincere Christians, not because Charles had forced them, but because, over time, the gospel found room to grow amid suffering. Patient monks, compassionate priests, and acts of charity broke resistance where violence had failed. Fear opened the door, but lived faith sealed the conversion, and yet the memory of terror never vanished. For centuries, the Saxons carried the reminder that their entry into Christendom was at the edge of the sword. For them, the cross was both a source of hope and a symbol of domination. This ambivalence would mark their identity deeply. Monasteries also became cultural frontiers. They served as outposts between the empire and the still pagan lands beyond. Germania was slowly drawn into the Christian West, but the tension between tradition and imposition never disappeared. Every new altar raised upon a sacred grove reminded all that faith here had been born in violence. Centuries later, when Christian chroniclers retold the story, they preferred to speak of the glorious conversion of the Saxons. They painted Charles as the champion of faith, erasing the shadows of blood. But in folk legends, the dead of Verden and the fallen forests lived on in underground memory. The official history exalted unity, but the people whispered their wounds. Thus, Saxon Christianization became the prime example of how faith and power can blur until indistinguishable. Charles had not only won militarily, he had redrawn the cultural soul of a nation. But at what cost? The answer was written not only in books but in scars. Scars of fear that made many accept the cross without understanding its meaning. Scars of broken families. Scars of a people who saw their ancestral faith treated as crime. And yet some scars turned into bridges. For paradoxically, some Saxons discovered in Christ not Frankish tyranny, but genuine consolation. A faith imposed became, for some, a faith chosen. Thus, the initial tragedy opened doors for future Saxon saints, monks, and missionaries who, centuries later, would carry Christianity to other peoples. The forced conversion was real, bloody, undeniable. But the faith born amid fear eventually shaped entire generations. The iron that once sought to break was itself forged into something else, a new identity, painful and contradictory, yet alive. And so, by the end of the 8th century, the Saxons were no longer only warriors of the forest. They were part of a greater Christendom, though with bitter memories. Monasteries stood on ruins, hymns echoed where war cries once rang, and the crucified Christ replaced the ancestral gods. The cross had prevailed, but the price was paid in blood. The story of the Saxons' conversion is not just a distant memory buried in medieval manuscripts. It is a mirror that still challenges us today. For in Verden, in the Capitulatio, and in Charlemagne's relentless marches, we see a question that stretches across the centuries. How far can faith walk hand in hand with power without becoming corrupted? The cross, meant to be a symbol of salvation, became a banner of domination. The sacred groves were cut down, and in their place rose altars. Yet the roots of a people cannot be erased by decrees. They endure, they resurface, they transform. Christianity did flourish in Saxony, yes, but in soil scarred by pain, and perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson. Faith can survive even when it is born in fear, but the scars of violence never fade. Today, when we speak of religious freedom, it is because we have learned, at the cost of blood, that imposed faith loses its meaning. Here on Faith and Power, our mission is to remember these stories so that they are not forgotten. If this reflection stirred something in you, subscribe, comment, and share. Because the story of the cross and the empire is still being written.